So morning everyone, and thank you for joining us. Wanted to do the introductions to everyone today. So we've got obviously myself and Eva, who run the user group, and then Chris, who I'm not going to ruin anything for Chris, but let's just say he works in player recruitment, and he'll tell you his story fully in a minute. The reason why we wanted to bring this session, which is slightly different to the ones we've done before, we've done a lot on sort of the actual physical game, the tactics and the variants that go around that, is that we know how bigger part effectively football transfers play and player identification play in the game. Effectively, if we could look at it in one specific way, clubs are asset-driven businesses, and they have 25 assets which define their season plus a manager. So this is really the lifeblood of a game, right? You don't see many other businesses that invest so much money into a specific like person for a business. So it's really interesting to see this from a different side. And actually, just this week, I was watching Leaders Linked, which had Miles Jacobson, who is the studio director from Football Manager, and also Les Reed, who's the FA's technical director, and also is ex-Southampton, and was sort of responsible for the black box method that I'm sure many of you have heard about there. And actually, it was now a long piece that went into loads of detail, talking about how important football data is in transfers. Miles even referenced that he gets calls from clubs on deadline day asking about player injury history and trying to get as much insight as possible to the player, because again, it's got to be such a big investment. So actually, this is a really powerful piece that I think Chris is going to come on to, and I'm just going to pass over to him in a second. But my last ask before we do that is, could everyone who's here more than welcome just to join the LinkedIn page that we started. So it's simply just named after this. So it's the Tableau Football User Group LinkedIn page. I think we've got 100+ members, and for the members that are in there already, please feel free to post some ideas in there, to post things you're working on, things you're stuck with, and connect with other users. Aware we've launched it in the link, but there's a bit more context to that at the moment. It's mainly myself posting links of the recordings, and we really want it to be an engaging sort of interactive place where we don't really say much. So with that, I'll pass over to Eva to say hello, and then over to Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Oscar, and hello from me as well. For those who don't know me, my name is Eva Murray. I'm a tech evangelist at Exasol, and I would love to connect with all of you on LinkedIn, so please do feel free to send an invite through, and hopefully we can, like Oscar said, get some discussions going on the LinkedIn group. And if you have questions, post them there, and I'm pretty confident that we can find the right people to tackle those questions if we can't answer them ourselves. But anything around, Tableau data visualization for your subject of football, just hit us up with that. And without further ado, I'll hand over the stage to Chris, who you all really want to hear from. So over to you, Chris.
Hello. So just wanted to sort of share a bit of my story about recruitment. So got a presentation. Oh, it says I can't share my screen.
Sure, let me just look.
Sorry, guys.
That's right.
So I couldn't.
I'm just changing that now.
Quickly talk through kind of.
There you go. Should be able to do it now.
Cool. So I probably have a fairly unconventional career, but I guess everyone in football has an unconventional career. So started off doing a physics degree. Started off working at Watford as an intern at first, then stayed around sort of as I finished and after I finished up my degree. Moved to Brighton for a couple of years, then a short spell at Sheffield United. Left football, trained as a physics teacher. I was happily teaching physics, and then I started working at Huddersfield summer 2017, so just after they got promoted. And then I left Huddersfield about a month ago, and I've actually just started working for the City Group, but I can't answer any questions about that, partially because I can't, and partially because I don't really know anything yet, because I've only just started. So all of these thoughts are kind of, they're not the thoughts of Huddersfield, they're not the thoughts of City, they're my own ideas of kind of how recruitment could be and how technology and Tableau in particular can help that happen. So I'm going to start with a bit of a story. So this isn't, again, this is a bit of an anecdote. It's not an insult at anyone in particular. So this is a story about when I was first starting out, Watford were in the Premier League at the time. I was an intern, and me and the chief scout just drove to Belgium and Holland a couple of times. And I think this is an extreme example. So we were looking for a left back for the first team. The manager wanted all the fullbacks to be big. We drove to Venlo to see the game. As you can see, 6 and a bit hours each way, and a Eurotunnel crossing. We sit there, the two teams come out ready for kickoff, and both the left backs are like 5'6" or something. So I'm sat there on the drive back thinking we could have known the height of the left backs before we got there and saved this time. And this is an extreme example of a wasted trip. It wasn't entirely wasted because we got to see the league, we got to see the level, we got to see some players we didn't already know. But it didn't find a left back, which is what we set out to do. And this is a very extreme example, but anyone who's ever done any live scouting will have definitely gone to a game and the player they wanted to see isn't selected or is on the bench or gets pulled or pulls up in the warm up, and it's just live scouting is just full of so much uncertainty. And it's what can we do to try and minimize that and try and maximize how effective our live scouting is. So I think the need for scouts and the role of scouts has changed as the game's gone on, be driven by technology. I think it's been driven a lot slower than most industries would have been. So I think in a lot of industries, if a new technology comes along that's cheaper than the old way, that technology is completely disruptive and completely changes that industry quickly. Whereas I think football's a bit more slower. Football recruitment is very traditional. So what we've seen happen is it's almost happened in parallel, and a lot of clubs have got a very traditional scouting department and a data department or data recruitment analysts as two separate teams almost that work in isolation with each other. And I think it's absolutely not what I'd recommend. I think integration is the key to this. So if we go back older than this newspaper article, if we go back from before these tools emerged, so before we had decent quality databases on the internet, you needed your scouts to tell you if Hartlepool had a young winger. You wouldn't have known that from your club in the south of England. So you could flick through the newspaper, you might see their names, you might see a bit about them. You needed the scout to tell you the guy existed. And then even when you've got these databases, so Soccerway, Soccerbase, Scout7, Transfer Market, I think most people will be familiar with these, but these will give you simple biographical information about the player. So where were they born, when were they born, where were they born, a guess at how tall they are, the position they've played, how many games they've played. So that will tell you, so you could then do a search, show me everyone under 25 who's starting as a striker in a league that I can afford to buy players from. But there'll be too many of them for you to go and watch them all live in a season. So if you're at a club and your chief scout has to see a player before you sign them, then your chief scout in England can only go to about 70 first team games a year, because in England, pretty much all the games are at the same time. So your chief scout needs to go and see 70 players who might not be perfect for you, but are close, are worth watching. So just because someone's young or someone's old or someone's played a certain number of games, it's not worth the chief scout driving the length of the country to see that player. So you had a regional network of scouts where they could see the player and they wouldn't say, sign that player. They'd say, this guy is worth the chief scout watching. And then a few years ago, so we're talking probably 13, 12 years ago, something like that, Y Scout started coming out. So the first Y Scout was sold by an agency, and it was a set-top box like a Skybox. So you plugged it into the internet, plugged it into a TV, browsed on a remote, and you chose your games. And to go from what I had before, which was a filing cabinet full of DVDs that I made by recording off Sky on a Skybox and then burning to DVD during the week, which took all week. So you'd fill the box up and then you'd have to sit there feeding DVDs and recording it back off. If there's any sort of veterans in the chat, they'll have done this on VHS instead of DVDs. And then to go from that, so for a League One team, you'd have a game a year. You'd have one Barnet game and one Port Vale game and one Wickham game. And if your target didn't play in that game, you didn't have any video footage on them. You might be able to record the Football League show and you might have a goal or two. So it was really difficult to get this footage. So as these resources have developed, so Instat and Wirescout have both grown their coverage and also their tools for accessing the coverage. For me, that could have changed how you structured a department, but I don't think it massively has at most places. And then kind of the next level of data is, you know, you've got Huddle, StatsBomb, who are going deeper on the data and are also trying to combine data and video, and then get to that next point and trying to be, Huddle in particular, trying to be more than just a data provider. They're trying to be kind of an end-to-end solution. So the issue with scouting that I think most people would recognize, this graphics from 21st Club. So people are scared of two things in scouting. So you talk to heads of recruitment, managers, chairmen, finance directors, people in the game, they're scared of two things. They're scared of a bad signing, obviously. I think everyone knows, can reel off examples of transfers that haven't gone as hoped. And then there's the other risk on the other side, the risk of missing out. And I think a lot of people are really driven by this risk of missing out. And this graphic from 21st Club kind of paints it as, if you've only got a finite amount of scouting resource, you could either do a couple of reports on loads of players, and then you'd have real coverage, but not very detailed. So you might make bad decisions because you've only watched players a couple of times. Or you could go the other way and you could just watch a handful of players in real depth and you'd know those players really well, but they might not be the best players. And I think kind of as this graphic suggests, you can push this curve out by looking in the right places, by looking at leagues and teams that are suitable for you, that you know you can afford to sign. I think there's too many examples I've seen, talking to people, being at games, seeing scouts write 22 reports on a game, or go into completely inappropriate games. Sort of, if you're working for a League One club, there's not going to be many players starting Championship games that are going to come to League One next season. So it's kind of, are you looking at players that you could achieve? Are you falling in love with these players and then finding out at the end of the process that they were never going to come to you? So would it have been more effective for your time to find out if you're likely to be able to afford them and then work out if you like them? Is it easier to work out if a player is good and if a player fits your club? Is that an easy decision, or is it easier to work out if they're likely to be affordable? And then I think for me, this doesn't have to just be a kind of one or the other. I think you can really balance both. So you can avoid the risk of missing out by being really proactive with your no decisions. So instead of having a rule of, we have to watch every player 3 times before we can say no, some players, if they're nowhere near your level or if they're not suitable for your team and they're never going to be, then you could say no after 1 report. And then you can save up all the times you've said no quickly, and you can use that resource on players that are close. And I think some of this comes down to team philosophy. So if you're at a team that have got a real strict passing philosophy, you need every player on the pitch to be technically good enough, you can very, very quickly say no to a lot of players, and then you can spend the time on the ones that are close. So you end up kind of avoiding both these things because of the way you've managed it. So I think I'd say every recruitment department, every club has a recruitment process. They might not call it a process. They might not realize, they might not have a flow chart, but you have one. Every club goes from looking at having the ability to look at every player in the world to signing some players at the bottom. So you might not strictly go through steps, but somehow you make that decision. So you could look at everyone in the world. For most clubs in the Football League, you wouldn't look at every league in the world because of work permits. So that would be a really sensible first criteria. It's definitely easier to work out if someone can get a work permit than it is to work out if they're good at football and if they fit your club. So work out the work permit fit first. And then if they go to another club in France and then someone comes into your office and says, why didn't we sign that player from Germany? Why didn't we know them? Why didn't we have 10 reports? because they wouldn't get work permits. They couldn't come to England. So it doesn't matter how good they are because I can't sign them. So it's trying to spend your resource on players that are close. So you go from every player in the world, you choose which leagues you look at, then you decide who you're going to watch a bit more, then you decide who you're going to watch a lot, and then you decide what players you propose, whether that be to a head of recruitment or a manager or to the chairman or a committee, however that falls in your club, and then you sign some players at the end of it, hopefully. And it's kind of, my thoughts have always been, can you manage this process and make sure that your coverage is therefore appropriate because you've actively managed this instead of it kind of being a bit accidental, I think, is what happens at most clubs. I think a lot of clubs, kind of accidentally decide who to watch. It will be based on which games are close, which players you've stumbled across, who do you see in the paper, and all those things are fine. But can you track this? Can you do this more deliberately and therefore do a better job of it? So I think this is kind of a rough guide. And again, this isn't from any of my employers. This isn't exactly what I've done anywhere. This is just sort of ideas. So I think the top point's really important. So I think having a clear club philosophy, which leads to clear player profiles, it's just really hard to recruit if your criteria is good, because there's different ways to be a good centre-back. There's different ways to be a good central midfielder. Your club philosophy might be really flexible in it. You might have a manager who really just does say, I just want the best players we can find. I'll knit them together into a team. So if the best left back you can find me is a really solid defensive one, then as long as the right backs can go both ways and can attack, or as long as the left winger is really good on his own and doesn't need support, then I'm happy as long as I can form my team together. That's fine, because that is some criteria, but that's going to be more flexible and it'll be harder to say no quickly. Whereas if your manager says, right, everyone needs to be physically dominant because I just want to play horrible aggressive football, then that's a really easy criteria to go and find. So I would normally say that limits and criteria are great because it helps you narrow down your shortlist quicker and then you can spend your time. So I think you get your club philosophy, you identify leagues you can afford to buy from, then you find players that fit in those leagues. So that might be from just biographical stats, players that have played minutes. It might be you might include ages in that, or it might be data driven. So you might have data from Opta, data from Huddle, data from Y-Scout, StatsBomb, wherever. You might have got some data source and you're going to, we're a possession team, so we're only going to find people that already make lots of passes or already make lots of successful passes, or we're only going to look for wingers that produce this many XG per game because our wingers need to cut in and have shots. Or however your philosophy works, you find a way of filtering. And I think you have to be honest that any kind of broad filter is never going to be perfect, but I would always push back and say it will be better than just randomly looking. So if you say, right, our game model spits out these things as things we care about, we're going to broadly filter on these. We know we will miss a couple of players that would be able to adapt, but as long as there's enough players that you can find that do it, then that's fine. I think if we go back to this, I would be really clear that this isn't actually, missing out isn't actually a big problem. Other clubs are going to have good players, and there's nothing you can do about that unless you're going to sign every player in the world. So this is the risk. Signing bad signings is the risk. So as long as at the bottom of your process, as long as at the bottom of this funnel, there's enough players for your club that fit your club that you can afford, I wouldn't be overly concerned if there's a player or two that you've missed for most clubs in the world. So then you're going to do some scouting, you're going to record your decisions somewhere and you're going to review them. And I think the idea behind this kind of idea is, can you improve the conversations that you have in your department? So kind of instead of, let's go to a game and see what's there, there's 325 players that we haven't made a decision on yet that are likely to play because they played last week. That's clearly a better reason for going to a game than to see what's there. Because I hear this all the time, that, let's see what's here. You hear other scouts talking, you talk to people, I'm just going to go have a look. Some of that's probably people being cagey and confidential, but I think often it is just people pick a game, they go, let's go have a look. Well, it's the home team, it's the away team. Maybe it's a slightly different in September, August, whenever football restarts, because the transfer window will be open for a long time. But for recent past, we've had transfer windows. So the squad is the squad that it was last week, is the squad that it was the week before. No, you're not going to go to a championship or a League One game and see some new players. You're going to see players that played the week before, generally. So can you kind of deliberately scout players instead of scouting games? And the same here. So kind of, oh, that looks like a good game. I'm going to go see a top of the table clash. I'm going to go see a relegation battle. I think those games, it is important to go and see big games, but it should be because there's a player you want to see. So we like that player. We haven't seen him for a month. Let's go see Saturday against a top opponent. For me, that's a really valid reason to go to a game, not just because it's a top game, because it's an exciting game, because it's where the other scouts that you know are going. And then I think this is the big one. So kind of when you get to the bottom and we found 3 left backs, instead of saying, oh, here's 3 left backs we like, which one do you want to sign? If you can say, oh, here's our opinion on every under 25 left back in the leagues we cover. There's 4 we recommend. There's 5 that are near misses because they're don't quite do this criteria correctly, and the rest that we've rejected. I think that's really powerful market intelligence. So if you know that you need to sign 3 players in a window, and you know that at one position your shortlist has got 3 players on it, and another position your shortlist has got 10 players on it, then that should drive which order you sign these players on. For me, that should be, rather than it kind of being, oh, well, we'll sign the player that's easiest to sign first, or we'll sign the player that, well, we'll wait till the player leaves and then we'll directly replace them. Well, if it's really hard to sign left backs and you've only got one that you like, then you need to sign that guy proactively. Whereas if you've got 10 central midfielders on a shortlist and you like all of them and they're all affordable, then you probably can wait till deadline day and do the Harry Redknapp leaning out a car thing and see who ends up the cheapest. But you need to know that. You need that market insight. I think just like when you're buying a house, you need to know if you're in a quick market or a slow market. There's not going to be hard and fast rules of there's always value at the end, there's always value at the start. It's going to depend on how many players are available at that level and how many buyers there are likely to be. So I just think this kind of bottom knowledge is perfect. But then if I go back to these tools, and this isn't a jab at any of these providers, they all do what they do well, but none of them, in my opinion, really let you run this kind of process. So it's kind of how can we, and they've all got slightly different data sources. So what I did was how can we join this data together to end up making it more powerful. So you take your stats from a provider. So most recently I was using StatsBomb, and then you take some stuff from Transfer Market, because no matter how big a data provider's coverage is, they haven't got under 23s football, they haven't got the conference, they haven't got the National League, they haven't got French third tier, whatever league you decide is interesting. So you've got some stats from here, some stats from here, and then for me, I had my scout reports all stored on ISF. And ISF is really good at storing information, linking it to the player and cataloging it. But then I find it's more powerful to export that and then manipulate that in Tableau. So I joined everything together in a database. This is kind of a fancy name, really. It's a spreadsheet that gives every player a unique ID and ties the different players' records together. So if everyone can help me lobby FIFA, what we need is every player to have a unique ID number, so that we can then tie all these data sources together manually, automatically. I don't think this is going to happen. My other slightly wacky idea is every position on the pitch should wear a different color boots, just to really help analysts tag in the games. I think that one's even less likely. But this was the idea. So kind of, can I get, using the tools I've got, all of these data sources together so that we can say, well, I want to see a little bit from this one and I want to blend it with this data source. And that's where Tableau comes into it. And it let me do things like this. So over here, you've got, I can zoom in, I think. Over here, you've got just reports by date and when the player states last changed and how many players there are in each position at the various stages. And kind of all this, in a normal industry, this would be just normal business intelligence dashboarding, but it's not really present on ISF. And the nice thing is if you can do it yourself in Tableau, you can then have all the filters that you want in the world. So you can then have a filter for each scout, you can have a filter for each country, You could change the color coding so it was leagues instead of types of report, and you can just manipulate it however you want, and you can get to that really powerful point of, I want to see what's happening, I want to see the story. And then this kind of covers down here the story I was telling about, can you provide that information? So can you tell your club, well, we know all the players we should know, so we've looked at the championship and we've made decisions on all of these players. These ones are no's, these ones are yeses, these are ones that we're still working on deciding on. So I think rather than kind of this feeling of there's 100 million, well, there's 100,000 players with transfer market pages or whatever, and how can I possibly know all of them? You can be methodical. So you can say, set yourself some rules. We're going to look at every under 25 player in League One, and we're going to come to an opinion. And then you can go and measure if you've done that or not. And I think that's one of the big issues with scouting generally, is you feel like you're never finished, you never get to the end of it. There's always more players. And I think actually that's not true. There's only a finite amount of professional players out there. So you can be a bit more methodical with it, and then you can feel like you've known the players you should know and have a bit of comfort, and hopefully be able to sleep at night, knowing that you've seen the ones that you should have seen. So I'm going to get to Tableau Prep. So Prep came out last year, I think, Oscar, is that right?
Yep, start of 2019.
Yeah, so it's kind of, it was the first page in Tableau Desktop where you could kind of do joins and stuff on your data sources, but way deeper. So effectively, it's in the data world, it's an ETL tool, so extract, transform, load. So that's taking data often from a couple of places. It can just be from one place, manipulating it and then working with it. And I'll show you an example of kind of a fairly simple flow I did recently of why this is a really useful tool. So you get this flow view at the top where you can see what's happening to your data, and it goes through in steps. So the first thing is you load in some data. So this is from Transfer Market. It's just a row per season for every player who played in the Prem last year. And then you load your data in, and you do get a bit of a preview in Tableau Desktop, but in this one you get a deeper preview of kind of some samples of what that looks like. You can click on data sample and see more. And you can also, over here, you can see I've joined together different files. So this is actually joined together the top 5 league files. And then you can clean it. So these lines are just steps where you're cleaning your data flow. So you can see on the left, it keeps track of changes you make. So for me, you really need to move away from just messing about in Excel. So I wish I'd learned all this stuff. I wish these tools were as developed as they are, but I wish I'd learned these tools before I had. So I spent probably the first 10 years living in Excel, tables and VLOOKUPs, and just messing around with stuff. And it's a powerful tool, obviously. But I think there's a few reasons for trying to move away from Excel where you can. And one of the main ones is this kind of transparency and this keeping track of what's happened. So if you take a data source in Excel and you start manipulating it, you start deleting columns or adding columns or changing data, you've got no real way of knowing what's happened to that data set. You could go through and undo it, or you could open an old version. But if someone else inherits that data set, they've got no real idea what's happened to it. Where with this, you could hand this over to someone else and they know what's happened because it's here. You've loaded these files, you've filtered out just to see this season, you filtered out just to keep some competitions, and you could click in and see which ones. You've excluded a league, you've changed a number type, you've filtered on a range of values, you've chosen which fields you want to keep. And you can see straight away some samples of the data. So you've got that record of what's happened and why, which makes handing over, it makes sharing work between teams much easier than just sort of a seemingly random spreadsheet. And it's just more sustainable. So now if I want to update this at some point in the future, I get new versions of my data, I save them over the old versions of the data or in a new place and point this to the new place. Then I hit the refresh button and this all just flows through, and the same transformations happen on the data that happened the first time I did it. And that just means that it's sustainable. You've built a proper tool. You've not just kind of hacked something together once, but it's actually no slower than doing this in Excel. And these tools are really useful. So I've then, this next step just joins things together, so aggregates together so that every player ends up with one row. So some of these players played for 2 clubs last season, but you only want 1 row per player. And I've then joined it to the same data source again. So what I've done is this one selects players that played in the top 5 league over 250 minutes last season, and it just tells me who those players are. And then I filter this list out to show me the careers of everyone who meets that threshold. And you can see here when I do a join in Tableau Prep, I tell it what I want to join together. I could have joined multiple things, but I'm confident my player code is unique. And then I choose, do I want just the things in the overlap of the 2 sets, or do I want everything else? So I want just the 2 things in the overlap. And you can see that of the second data set, it's excluded this many. And what I could do is I could click this button here and it would show me what I've excluded. So you can really quickly check, what have I kept? What have I not kept? Is that the right thing? And you can scroll along, you get these little graphs, so you can see straight away what's been excluded. And then when you start working with numbers like this, you can see it shows me, instead of just showing me a list of values, it shows me a chart. So that one's not that useful, but the age one shows me, yeah, that looks like it's a bell curve. It's what you'd expect a player's careers to look like. So that shows me that I've got the right data. If I had a big spike of 40-year-olds, I'd know that something had gone wrong in the data somewhere. Quite a lot of the time you end up with a big spike of 60-year-olds and 50-year-olds where you're adding together 2 years, and everyone's age gets doubled. And again, you can see I've done 15 changes to this. A lot of them are really trivial. They're just number changes, format changes, but again, it's tracked, it's recorded. I then added together just the name of the seasons just to tidy up the start dates of the seasons, and then another clean, and then I've exported it. And you choose where it goes, you choose what format, you run your flow. And once you've built this flow, updating it with updated data would take like literally seconds to rerun. So I think it's a real clear example of where it might look like a lot, but when you go through it step by step, it's easy to understand, it's easier to follow. It's definitely the way to go with Tableau Prep. I'd really recommend it as a tool. And then this is the big prep that ended up powering. So if I go back to this diagram, this is the Tableau Prep that kind of sits here, that takes all these separate data sources and joins them together. So I'll quickly talk through. So basically the top one, we take in the exports from Scout 7. This little plus there shows you that it's multiple sheets. So it ended up being about 12 exports from Scout 7 each time. And then you're joining them together, joining together the name of the league and the scout that owns that league. You're adding in the player reports folder from here, and the player reports folder is a separate prep that's working. You're doing some cleans because you end up with a load of duplicate columns. You end up with columns you don't need, and it just makes your final workbook run quicker. So this went through a real iterative process where I would do the first prep, check it works, check it's what I've got, and then you'd go back through over time. So maybe every few weeks you go do a bit of an audit of your Tableau workbook and sort of go, right, so that row, is that getting used anywhere? No. Am I ever going to use it? No, I don't think so. And if I wanted to, I could add it back in. So I'm just going to remove it here, and then that way everything runs a bit faster. So I think that idea of it kind of it growing and it changing. So I think for me that worked really well. So yeah, you end up with this one, which exports kind of my cleaned and tidied Scout 7 reports folder and players file. This one joins together the teams, and kind of this one, you can see it looks really messy, but you can walk through it. And I think like any data tool, if you just see the end product, it looks a bit intimidating, but I didn't just sit at a computer in one session and just do this from start to finish. Just like when you see code, you don't just sit there and type out all the code from start to bottom. You do a little bit, then you realize, oh, I need a loop there, I need this there, I need this there, and it just grows. So this just grew and grew over time. And then these ones are to combine together, transfer market updates and join last year's to this year's and that kind of thing. And then these ones, you've got what I call check files. So you do a join, and you can see on this join, it's just looking for the outside of the Venn diagram. So all these ones here, these missing matches. So what that's looking for is, I really should have put that diagram in twice. So what this looking for is, show me everyone who's in this data set or this data set or this data set who doesn't match my matching data set. So that means that I didn't have to manually go through and see who hasn't got a match. So you put your new data in, you hit refresh, you run your check files. They should be blank. They're not going to be blank because there'll have probably been some debutants that you haven't already got a match for. You then match those players in your match, and then you rerun that, and then you end up with your finished data. So it looks like a lot, but it's definitely quicker than trying to manually combine data sets. And then it lets you do things like this. So this one that I ran through already, this one that I've redacted quite a lot, but you can see what it is. So this is a short list of players. Instead of just having their name, you've got age, so you can do age calculations. So I would normally present decimal ages because I think generally when you're recruiting, it does matter if someone's just turned 27 or is about to turn 28. There's a difference between someone who was 19 and someone who's 19.9. So trying to add that in was easy in this tool, but impossible in Scout 7 or impossible in StatsBomb because they just present the way they present. And then you mix in how many times have we seen this player? When was the last time we saw them? So instead of having to go through a list and manually open every single report page, when did we last see them? You can do that automatically. So you can then filter on it. So you can really easily create a view that's show me all the players that are at a certain stage of the process who we haven't seen for 3 weeks. And then that's a piece of work that you allocate out. So instead of having to manually keep on top of players and reports and when you've last seen them, the system can do this because you've got all the data in the right format. And then this one is a view per scout or column per scout. Each one's a timeline. And again, you can adjust these times, but for us, we were just looking at this season. And then each shape shows you a type of report and each color shows you a verdict at the end of our reports. And then you just hover over and in this box, it pops up with the text of the report. And it's just way quicker than reading it in Scout 7 or in anything, whatever your report system was. If you had something in-house, it would still be quicker to load it all in Tableau and just see them all in the tooltips than it would be to open a page and to see each report separately. And then once you've got your data combined, you can start doing cool stuff. So instead of looking at, so here's a list of overage players who played in Premier League 2. So if you think who's likely to be available for loan in January, well, if the Prem clubs, they're likely to have played at least one under 23s game this season, if they're likely to be available for loan. But if you don't want the really young ones, then you look for the overage players because they're obviously some of them like Hector Bellerin was never going to go on loan to the Championship. He was playing 23s football just for injury rehab, but that's fine. He's easy to filter out. And then you can see what stage are they at, how many reports have we got, when was the last time we saw them. You can do a calculation, so you can put percentage minutes in instead of just minutes. And the same thing, so instead of giving a scout a list and just said, all right, here's all the top goal scorers, you say, here's all the top goal scorers and what we already think of them and how much work we've already done. And then that helps you really quickly work out where the gaps are and where you need to go do some scouting. The same with this one. So you take Transfer Market and you export it, or you get it from Opta, however you want. You've got your ages, you've got minutes. This is filtered to right backs in League One. And then every single dot's a player. And every the size is how many reports we've got, and the color is what state they're at. So you can see really quickly, this player's rejected. We've done loads of work. It's a big dot, so I'm happy with that. These ones, that's quite a small dot, but then he's over 27. He's in League One, so we're not likely to sign a 27-year-old from League One. So I'm happy with that being a small dot. Whereas down here, happy with these being small dots because they've not played much. And it's just a really quick, at a glance way of going, right, so actually, if we want to sign a player from this league in this position, this is what there is. So where I've said it's useful to have player profiles, it's useful to have a type, you also have to be realistic. So you could turn on all the leagues that you think you're likely to sign players from. This is who there is. So this kind of really brings back that reality to it of you can only sign a player that exists. You can't sign a player from a hypothetical profile. So they have to play minutes if they're coming from a lower league. they have to be under a certain threshold, otherwise the chairman won't sign it off. So which of these guys do we want? And then you go through and you work out which ones are no's. And then the nice thing about having that decision recorded, so we recorded it as a player state at Huddersfield. So there's a box under everyone's name in ISF. You can choose who's allowed to see them and who's allowed to edit them. So you could have it. So if you had part-time scouts, they can't see the states at all. Full-time scouts can see them but not change them. And then you could have it so your coordinator, your chief scout can change the states, something like that. And then that's just a way of recording the decision of where is this player? How much work have we done on them? How much do we like them? And then that means that when you're looking at a name, you're not saying no to the same name over and over again. So if you just exported a list of League One under 23s and kept giving that to the scout that covers League One for you, he's just going to end up going through and just crossing out the same names every single week and highlighting the same names every single week. And he's going to miss the new players that have come on because that's human nature. So if you can combine that and you can already give him, right, here's a list of League One that you haven't already said no to. Here's a list of League One that you've said yes to, but you've not seen in the last month. And you can automate a lot of the coordinating by having all this data combined in one place. And then the last thing that you can do with Tableau is if you've got everything in a Tableau notebook, you can then publish it to Tableau, and then you can see it on your phone. So you need to invest in some licenses, and yeah, it's an extra cost. But I trialed this at a few games, and it's really powerful. You go to a game, you choose your teams, and on your phone you've got ages, contracts, agents, and what your club currently think. So if there's someone on the bench that you didn't expect there to be on the bench, you know straight away, oh, well, actually one of the scouts saw him at a 23s game 3 weeks ago, and he really liked these things about him, and he's got concerns about this. So if he gets on the pitch, I know what to look for. So can you elevate? So can you use data and organization to be at better games in the first place? And then once you're at the games, can you give that data to the scouts to let them watch the game they're at better than if they didn't have that information? I know some people would be completely against that. They'd argue that you should go in cold, the scouts should go in, they should know nothing. You should treat every player like a blank canvas and take them as they come on the day. And I appreciate that argument. I think there's a place for that argument, but I think generally we all work for one club. You should start from what you already know. And I'd say that most scouts I know back themselves in what they see. So if they see a player, even if they know that someone else in the department liked them last week, if they've seen them and they don't like them, every scout I've ever come across would still say they don't like them. So I think that's it. So yeah, I'm aware I've just been sort of rambling on. So yeah, any questions or anything people want more on? Or
for the questions, if you want to put them all in the Q&A box, I've seen one in the Q&A box and two come through on the chat. So we'll start with them, but this will be your point, everyone, to start putting your questions in. Let me go to the first open question, and then I'll come across the ones that were misplaced into the chat. So the first question you've got from Ronan was, can you speak to the process of turning footballing qualities into identifiable metrics? Things like tall are easily done, but what qualities like aggressive are you looking at? So mentions there, it's guessing about sort of collaborating between leadership and data workers as an idea. I want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so that's a real kind of, it's an ongoing piece of work. I think we're not at the point where baseball's at, where it's a simpler sport and it's more quantifiable about what's good and what's not good. So I think some of those things, like you say, like aggressive, I assume it means aggressive in a good way. It is a hard thing to quantify from event data. So there's a few different types of football data. So you kind of got at your simplest, I'd call biographical. So just how many games have they played, how many minutes. The next level would be event data. So that's where you get, depending on the provider, a couple of thousand rows of data a game. So, and nearly all of those are on ball actions. So it's for a pass, who passed it, what foot, where were they standing, when was it? And then if you add in stats bomb, they then code pressure events. So if someone made a deliberate attempt to press the ball. So I think and then the next level would be tracking data, which is where you get a coordinate of every player and the ball multiple times a second. So I think most people in the industry aren't doing a lot with tracking data. I think there's still a lot we can squeeze out of event data that's much easier to work with. And the other issue is its availability. So I might only have tracking data on the league I'm working in, whereas I've got event data on about 50 leagues, but I can get that biographical data, that what games did they play in and when. I can get that on hundreds of leagues. So it's trying to work out what questions do I want to answer and kind of what's the easiest way of answering it. So I'd say that you don't have to answer everything with data for data to be useful. So you might decide that I could look at event data. I could try and measure how long does it take, what's the average time between an opponent receiving a ball and the player I'm looking at tackling him. That could be a measure of aggressiveness for sixes or central midfielders. But you could also answer that by looking at 5 minutes of clips on Y Scout, or by talking to your scouts who have already watched him. So I think it's trying to work out, if I've got 5 criteria that are deal breakers for this position, and I need to go from every player in the world to which are the 100 that I'm going to do some proper scouting work on, what's the easiest and the most accurate way to go from that list to that list? And you might decide that some of the personality stuff, some of the off the ball stuff will happen further down your process, and you'll focus on the stuff that's kind of really discrete, really black and white, if they've done it or not, and you'll do that earlier on in the process. But I think it mostly comes back to knowing your data sources. So you need to know, there's a lot of discussion constantly online about this data source is inaccurate because it doesn't match with this one, and I disagree with that. I think they're all accurate within themselves, but they're measuring slightly different things. So they're measuring what they say they're measuring. So you need to know what their definitions were to start with. Is a big part.
Okay, cool. Thanks for that. So we've got 2 questions from Craig here, and they were asking in the chat, so I'll come back to Q&A in a second. But the first one was, what would happen if something changed in the underlying data source? So I believe that was when we're looking at the flow that was created when that question was asked.
Yeah. So effectively on this big prep, so all of these data sources are kind of like CSV, so Excel extracts. None of these are connected to live databases, although you can do that, but that's not what we had set up. So what would happen is, kind of every Monday, Tuesday at the start of the week, I would go on to StatsBomb and re-download the up-to-date data, save it over the old data, re-get my transfer market data, redo the exports from Scout 7, save over all of the old versions, and then just refresh this and then run my checks and then do my big export. So it's definitely, it's fine. That's kind of, this is designed to be run over and over again. And you can actually schedule Tableau prep. So if you know that, if you've got a way of automatically doing your export, so if you can get it set up, so either an intern or a person you employ or your data provider, if they can put something on a shared drive at a certain time, you could then run the prep automatically on a server later that afternoon, and then this would all happen behind the scenes.
Great.
But for me, I found doing it manually worked fine.
Craig also asked, how do you quantify the qualitative metrics, personality, leadership, etc., and which could be the difference in / driver in pushing a player?
For me, I think it's kind of recognizing the limitations of data and not trying to do things that it's not designed to do. So it might sound like a bit of a cop-out, but don't. So I think it's not data or scouts, it's not data and scouts, it's both. It's using data to help the scouts, using scouts to help the data. For me, you don't need to spit out, this player's a 27, our algorithm's done all this stuff, and here's this player, sign this one because he's a 27 and this one's only a 26. I don't think you need to get it to that point. I don't think you can accurately get it to that point. I think it's fine to just say, we like these players because of this data, and we've then done this work on them, and out of the 5 that we like from data, these are the 3 that we like the most from the scouting, from the subjective side. I think that's absolutely fine.
Okay, brilliant. We've got another question here from an anonymous attendee. So it's saying that she works within the women's championship with data that's readily available. Again, should correct myself there, it's he or she may work in the women's championship with data that's readily available of any real quality and less accessible compared to the championship / League One type of data. Is there anything in particular which helped you in your early days prior to the launch of the data, like Y-Scout, etc.?
Yeah, so I think from the kind of the recruitment side, there's still great value in just knowing who's there. So even if there's not a ready-made data source you can start from, I don't know, it's been a while since I've worked in women's football, so I'm not sure how detailed on players sort of FA full-time is at that level, or if there's a better data source now. But even if you're starting from scratch and you just have a spreadsheet that sits on a shared drive that people at your club can share, that they all drop names that they hear in, and then at least that way you've captured that information, and you can then do a sort of allocate work on it and fill in the columns as you do more and more work. So kind of from the organization side, even if you haven't got that ready-made data source, you can still capture some of that information and kind of keep sort of a version of this kind of process. So where I've said, oh, you start from every player in the world and then you filter them out, you don't have to. You could start from a blank spreadsheet and sort of decide where you're going to look, and then you add the players in as you go down this, but you can still track it some way. So you maybe couldn't say, here's our opinion on every under 25 left back in the league we cover, but you could say, here's our opinion of the 10 left backs that we've looked at seriously. These are the 3 we'd recommend because, and then from more the kind of match data side, I wish looking back, I wish I'd been a bit more pragmatic. So before I had readily accessible data, we were trying to kind of code every touch that the player had ourselves, and that takes a couple of hours a game. But we could maybe have been a bit more pragmatic. So for strikers, we could have just fast forwarded until they were in the box and just coded what they were doing in the box. So again, that depends what video footage you've got available. But yeah, I think that's something you could do. You could be really pragmatic with your data. You could say, we really care about centre backs doing this, or wingers doing this, or goalkeepers doing this, and we're just going to code these 5 attributes, these 5 stats for as many players as we can find video on, rather than code in every game for less players.
Okay, brilliant. That's really, really good, and hopefully useful answer to that one. We had another question coming through from Thanos, quite a detailed one, but wants to know a bit more about the behind the scenes sort of realities of the job in performance and scouting and analysis. So kind of understanding, do clubs just want you to come into the role, set up the department, build a database, etc., and then that's the project? Or like, you know, you've had a number of different roles, so kind of just to give a bit of a sort of further deep dive into actually day-to-day.
I think all my jobs have been to go in and sort of have an ongoing role in the recruitment department, and the data and the tools I've kind of built and brought ideas with me has kind of been almost my way of making my job easier. So I think there probably is a niche for people who go in and set a department up, but I've not heard of it. I think it's something that maybe that's something Tableau have supported with. It's definitely something that Huddle will do. They'll go in and they'll do an audit of a department, and they'll build some tools and some workflows, and then go and then leave the people behind to run it. So I think it's something that maybe could happen, but for me, I've always sort of had an ongoing role in the recruitment departments, and this has been a little part of my job that's overtaken and become a bigger part. But yeah, that's the way I've always seen it. This is me trying to almost make my life easier. But then that sounds lazy, but it's make my life easier so I can then spend the time with the scouts and looking at players instead of spending the time on spreadsheets.
Okay. Great. The final question we've got here, and again, if there are any more, feel free to fire them across. We've got another one, in fact, just come through. But how would you sell that data process to departments that are less interested, don't have resources for the databases / licenses? So just on that as well, I think that's a really good point. And actually, before you answer that, Chris, Ravi, who presented on the last user group with us, has obviously gone over to City Football Group, and that's part of his role. So actually, just from my personal experience there, that clubs are investing in people being able to kind of bring data across to people who necessarily might not be less interested per the term, but just aren't data literate. So there's actually becoming roles like that in football. Good to get your opinion on that as well, Chris.
Yeah, I think data in football is definitely going to grow over the next however many years. I think obviously people have seen Liverpool's success, and the narrative in the media is the data's had a big part of that. So I think some clubs are doing it because they were either already doing it or they see that and they want to replicate it for the same reasons. Some people are maybe just copying it, and maybe it doesn't have that real depth of thought behind it. I think I don't think I'd ever want to be in a position where I just said, here, buy my data flow, buy my Tableau prep, because for me, it's about working out what questions you want to answer as a club, and then working out how can you answer those questions. So it's maybe quite a bespoke thing. I think there's probably also kind of copyright type issues with selling that kind of work, because it's not my data necessarily, all of it. And I think that companies will get, maybe better is the wrong word, but I think I would expect sort of Huddle, StatsBomb, these types of companies to be looking at, they're always developing their tools. So I think they're looking at how can they make it more streamlined, how can they get that going. So I think the resources is a difficult one, but I think you can do a lot with not much. So actually, it's making that business case, isn't it? Which I think is probably why it needs to be someone on the inside. So kind of if you're working in that club and you recognize that your club spend X million a year on players' wages, and you think that having some Tableau prep and some Tableau licenses would help make those decisions better, then why wouldn't you? And it's about making that case, isn't it? Of if we're making these multi-million-pound decisions at the end of the process, then can we please allocate some appropriate resources to make that happen?
Yeah, definitely. It's more than just Tableau in that it's a whole data process, like you've said, and understanding where data or analytics sits in a workflow is probably the first part of that, and then it kind of evolves, like you said, right? You didn't just build that flow overnight.
Yeah, I didn't just build that overnight. Yeah, and it's not having the data. You need the data, but you need the workflow is the most important part for me. It's kind of what decisions are you going to make based on the data? So you could take any one of those data sources out and it would still be useful. You could do an awful lot just with transfer market, which isn't a subscription. So you could do a lot with not much. As long as I think the workflow and the organization is the main part, and then adding the extra data enriches those decisions.
Brilliant. So we've got another question come through from Elliot, who's worked within scouting at RB Leipzig. What are your thoughts on bringing traditional scouts into the process? Would you look to adapt your data for different audiences or even individuals, or are you looking to bring everyone up to speed with the way you're working, expecting them to sink or swim?
No, I think it's a real balance, and sort of, it sounds really cheesy, but it's bringing people on that journey and getting people to a point where they see the benefits in it. I think there's a lot of people that talk about kind of data versus scouts, and in other fields sort of data versus physios or data versus sports scientists. And I think it shouldn't be that way. For me, the two are completely entangled. So I think generally I've seen Ted from StatsBomb say this kind of, if you do your data filtering right, then your scouts are happier because they don't have to watch as many bad players. So I think I'm aware, I'm fortunate, like when I started at Huddersfield, the scouts were younger than average in the industry, shall we say, and probably more willing to go along with this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But at the same time, my process massively relies on people, because I know the limitations of my data. So a lot of this isn't really heavily data led, it's organization. So it's, you know, these stages where we're talking about players that we watch more, the thing that decides if we watch a player once or 3 times or 10 times isn't really the underlying data, it's what the scouts say. So a lot of what I'm saying to the scouts is, I'm here to support you. So I'm here so that you don't have to feel you have to run around finding people. You don't find players, that we find players between us and we decide what work to do. And then I'm here to make sure you don't forget players. So you don't have to worry about remembering names. You don't have to worry about keeping track of who you liked and who you didn't like in a little notebook. You put your reports in the system and I'll keep track of who you've liked and who you haven't liked. So I'll give you a dashboard on a Monday morning that says, here's debutants, here's people that made a debut in your league over the weekend, here's players with top stats, here's players that you liked that you've not done a report on for a month, here's the guys that the chief scout's still working on that you recommended, so you've still got visibility of what he thinks. And it's all based on almost giving information that they've given to me back to them. So it's absolutely not data versus the scouts, it's data to support the scouts.
Okay. That kind of links in actually with Jason Todd's question around how do you deal with the staff that might not always buy into your approach that you're bringing. So potentially you might even want to throw an example of that. I'm sure there's been a few times where that may have happened.
Yeah, I think a lot of people sort of are too kind of black and white, too bullish with the data. So I don't think that I've seen data I don't think I'd sit there with a scout and say, no, you're wrong. You're saying that guy can pass. I'm saying that guy can't pass because my stats model says this, and you've only seen him twice. I think it's the scout's opinion is valid. If the scout's done work on a player, that they have a valid opinion, and you just need to bear in mind that they've seen a couple of games, and you've got data from across a season, hopefully. So it's trying to understand what have they seen and why have they seen it, and what does your data say and why does your data say that. So I think it's, if you go into a club and you sort of say, I've got my data, my numbers say this, you're all wrong, then of course you're going to have a bad time with people. But if you go into a club and you say, right guys, instead of you feeling like you have to watch every player in the world, we're just going to know these guys, and between us, we're going to know these guys inside out. That's really exciting. I think most scouts would feel much happier if they had to know 100 players really well rather than 1,000 players, because it's not possible to know 1,000 players. Sorry, 1 second.
Sure. You're back in now, I think. Sure. Can you still hear us, Chris?
Yeah, sorry, the battery's run out.
No worries at all. No worries at all. But we can still see you and hear you. So all good that side. Are you happy to take another question?
Sorry, am I back?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah.
All good. So was that as far as you want to go on that question, or you?
I think so, yeah. So it's that blend. It's knowing that there's no point. I don't think there's any point just having data. I think if someone said to me, go into a club at a level where there's data, you've got no scouts, you're not allowed any resource for scouts, it's just you and some data sources, you sign the players, I'd be really uneasy with that. I think you'd make decisions, you'd sign players that don't fit because of all those intangibles that you want. So I think you definitely need scouts, and I think the people that sort of stomp around in the football data world are missing the kind of the reason for it. So it's got to be that blend.
Yeah, and I think on that point as well, Jason, there's a number of clubs that I speak to that have Tableau as part of their onboarding, and also have like a data culture around the club or the organisation. So actually, when someone starts in a role or is early on, it's easier to put those ideas in there as like you said, coming in somewhere where they can, and it's more normal, right, an historical way of doing things. So it's just to try and think about a way moving forward, which actually leads quite nicely into this next anonymous
well, I was just going to say for that one as well, sorry, that I think Tableau can be a big part of that. So I think if you can have, even if you can't get licenses and you can't get people Tableau licenses, you can still say, you probably don't, you still save a package and put it on a OneDrive somewhere, and then you can have people on Tableau Reader. So that means that they can't really change the views, but they can use the filters and they can see dashboards. So if you can create this real self-service culture where it's not the data person sat in a corner with a laptop going, that player's rubbish, that player's great, that player's rubbish, and just sort of undermining people. If instead the data culture is, we're all in this together, they're our players, they're not data players, they're not scouts players, they're our players. Then if you can have that culture where the scouts can go on their laptops and see the players, see these dashboards, see this data, that self-service culture, I think really helps. And then stops that them and us if everything's open.
Yeah, brilliant. And that leads into the question of, where do you see data analytics being evolved in clubs in the next 5 years? So kind of a vision question.
Yeah, I think it's going to grow. I think it will see someone in a role at every club. I think there's probably more people in these kind of roles than people might maybe suspect. I think like people don't always want to jump up and down and be really public about the smart stuff they're doing. I think most people are kind of trying be a bit discreet about it, but I think it will grow. I think there's some definite wins in organization terms, in thinking about pathways and squad balance, and where are you going to loan your players to, and where are you going to sell players for best value. There's definite, I know you've had talks about kind of the huge amount of data that the sports science and fitness guys can produce, and trying to leverage that in a smart way. I'm somewhat skeptical about things like injury prevention beyond kind of the obvious kind of things that I think most physios would do. But I think the more data we have in that kind of field, the more questions we can answer, the more predictive it becomes. I think for kind of opposition scouting, I think tracking data is probably a real big one. So trying to have tools where you can see similar situations. So I've seen some stuff presented where you take tracking data and you say, I want to see, you skip the video to a situation and say, I want to see other things like this. So I think it's kind of, I think, a common misconception from coaches, where because you can walk into your analysts and go, I want to see all the goals that team conceded, or I want to see all the set pieces that team took. You can do those things because those things are coded. Someone sat there and said, this is a goal, this is a wide free kick, but no one sat there and said, this is a 2v1 overload. So I think there's probably a lot of frustrated analysts where sometimes coaches ask questions that they can filter situations really quickly. Sometimes they can't and they have to go watch the game again. But tracking data will mean that there'll be more and more of those situations where you can get there. And I think we will get to a point where we can use sort of data analytics, machine learning, whatever. We can use the data we've got to watch game players and get teams in a smarter way. So instead of saying we're going to watch 5 games and we're just going to watch 5 full games, we're going to watch 3 full games, the most recent 3, and then we're going to watch 180 minutes of whatever the AI said is most unique over the last season. And the same for players. So instead of saying, right, I'm going to watch 5 games of the player, I'm going to watch 3 games, and then I'm going to ask the AI, can I see the weirdest stuff he's done, or can I see the best stuff he's done, or the worst stuff he's done? And kind of use that as a way of, I'm not just looking at the most recent stuff, but I'm also not just looking at a random sample. I'm looking at a sample that's been tuned for me. And I think that will grow and grow.
Right, great. We had a question from Amrit Powell asking around if you'd considered in the past using social media, like Twitter data, for example, around players. So this example he gives is the top 10 left backs in League One. And also the reason for that is to give you a bit further sort of scouting intelligence and to understand a bit more about what the audience and people are saying around players, just to see if you considered that.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a useful source of information, this idea of crowdsourcing things. People are going to know it. People are like the Football Manager data source is a big data source, and it started off from the guys that wrote fanzine articles when Championship Manager first started. And I know like Miles Jacobson at Football Manager said that was tuned because if the guys that wrote the fanzines, who would now be the guys that are active on social media, these guys are going to be, the guys they hate aren't going to be as bad as they say they are, and the guys they love aren't going to be as good as they say they are. So can you take kind of that consensus view and moderate it a little bit? I think kind of the more data, the merrier. So if you've already done your work on a league and then you have a browse on Twitter, then you might see a name that you wouldn't have otherwise seen. Why wouldn't you throw that into the mix? And I think that's where you don't have, something doesn't have to decide whether you sign someone or not for it to be useful. Whether that be objective data or subjective data, it's still useful if it just comes into it. It doesn't have to be definitive to be useful.
Yeah, and I think on that as well, it's a really interesting point of identifying people, because we talked a little bit offline about the sort of lower than the National League, right? National League South, National League North, the step 4s, 5 and 6s, and potentially again one to identify with yourself, Jason, who I know is still on the call. The FA full-time league has all this tracks, all the data, right, of player names, goals, assists, as long as they're inputted correctly by the clubs. And there's obviously that requirement too. There's obviously an idea that, you know, what if the FA could leverage that, and instead of it being in the format, because it looks like an Excel format, I don't know anything behind it, but if they could connect to something like that to be able to give you a much wider view of potentially players at step 6, step 7, step 5.
Yeah, I mean, and this is kind of the idea of Tonsa. So Tonsa is a Danish company doing basically that for youth football. So they provide every player and every star coach in the league this app. I think they have launched in England now. So Huddersfield worked with them for a bit. They've signed a few players from it. And essentially every player records like a score out of 5 or 10 or whatever for every player in the game and votes for a man of the match. So because that's then that team are cross-checking themselves and the opponent are cross-checking them. So a kid can't go on there and just vote themselves man of the match every week because no one else will. And then that docks the player points basically. So it's all tuned behind the scenes to make sure that it bubbles up the players who are genuinely good in these youth leagues. And what Tonsa have done is they've taken this kind of crowdsourced information from youth players, and they've just, without watching the players, and they've just taken them like a best 11 out of a country, and they've played some big academies and put some good teams together and got players signed. So I think there definitely is some merit in at the lower levels, that kind of crowdsourced data and using that big data to kind of bubble up players up the pyramid. Definitely.
Okay, great. I had one from Rowan here around, are there any events, forums, groups, communities, etc. for data workers across clubs, or does competition mean that it doesn't particularly exist? So obviously we've got this in the Tableau Football Use group and the LinkedIn page, but it'd be good to get your outside view of other places that happens.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. So I think there's things like the Opta Pro Forum. Mladen at Leicester ran a data conference this year that was really good. So there are things like that where people will meet and chat, but it tends to be kind of big ideas rather than anything specific because of that competition element. So it's a blend. I think people will share ideas, people will help people out, but it tends to be maybe a little bit secretive.
That's that.
And then
between the two.
I think Twitter as well. So like, I'm not going to go on Twitter and share this stuff, share graphs I've done. I'm not going to, if I've made some charts comparing some targets, I'm not going to whack it on Twitter because that's for my club for now. And I'm not going to put the stuff that led to a dossier for a player I've signed on Huddersfield. I'm not going to put that on Twitter now because, one, it belongs to the club I work for, not me. And two, it's not the right thing to do, is it? So I think most people in pro clubs are going to be really limited about what they actually share online. But I think there are people that look, there are people, I've DM'd people offering feedback. So I think there is this thing where I think people feel they can't necessarily do stuff publicly, but I think there is still support. Measurables have just started doing called office hours. So there's people, pro people in the game who have, across sports, who have signed up to kind of support and mentor people. So I think that kind of thing is really cool. North Analytics, so Smart Scout, they've sponsored interns and stuff over the past. So I think the biggest thing is just to get going. Like, the access to the data was always a big issue. So even a couple of years ago, people were still working with a season of Premier League data from like 10 years ago that Man City sponsored Opta to release, because that was the most up-to-date data. Whereas now, Statsman have got loads of data released. They've got tutorials of how to work with it in R. They've got an R package that helps you work with it. There's other packages that help. FCR Stats is really good for getting started. Loads of tutorials on there. So I think you're not starting from scratch anymore. There's tutorials out there. So I think Twitter's probably the main thing.
Yeah, we all have a responsibility as well to try to innovate the industry, but sometimes that can be connecting on a one-to-one basis, and that's what we're trying to do. Obviously here, but in the wider scale, same. I don't think you'd be against anyone reaching out to you, right? Just in general.
No, I'm always happy to talk to people. It's obviously just trying to balance time and trying to balance. Like, I'm not going to come in and do your job for you, and I'm not going to give out all of my secrets. But I think hopefully, like people have seen today, I'm probably more open than the average person. I think this might sound really arrogant, but it's not about the tools. At the end of it, it's not about the tools you have. It's about how you use them, and if your club make the decisions. So I think, as much as I'm not going to drop this prep on an open shared drive, and I'm not going to give people all my work, but I'm going to share some of the ideas, and help people out get going if that's what they're after. But mostly it's about what you do with it.
And that's a good one. And we've got our final question here, anonymous one again. What are the typical pitfalls you see when setting up Tableau dashboards? And they use, because besides player IDs is one. So this can be obviously Tableau, but if you want to make that a wider question of your process, then feel free to.
Trying to think. So yeah, like we said, a big one is joining players together across data sources. There's a few weird things with football. So like trying to do maps is always awkward, because England's not a country, England's a sub-region. So that just breaks maps. So you can either just pretend that England's the UK and not worry about Scotland, but you probably do want to worry about Scotland. So mapping can be a bit awkward for that kind of thing. What else have I found awkward? It's mostly just getting your data in the right format, is most of the issue. And then I guess having the ideas and then getting it going. So I think it's probably trying to avoid that temptation to just throw every single data source in. So if you throw in too much, then it will be too slow and it'll be really clunky and it won't load. And so it's probably being selective and growing it gradually. I think it's starting from a point of view of what questions do I want to answer, and then going and finding what you've got that can answer that question and building it up from there, rather than just trying to kind of throw everything in and then seeing what you can do. I think that's always kind of quite an important thing, is sort of start at the end. What do you want to see? Then work backwards and build it.
Just had one last question pop in. What happens if you notice an error later on in the process? Maybe the report's already built.
Well, I think that's kind of the beauty of something like Tableau, is you're not going to have issues like you might get in Excel, where you might accidentally delete a column, or you might accidentally like sort. So if you've got your data in Excel, it's really easy to select half the data and sort half of it, and then it's all scrambled and doesn't match up. So I think by having a robust data flow, you avoid a lot of the issues. And then if it's something like, so I've done this where I might have only refreshed half the leagues from StatsBomb or from Scout7. I might have only done half of my exports, and then I've got half new data, half old data. And kind of the beauty of if you can get to a point where everyone's self-service and everyone's going onto a system and pulling the reports themselves, you can then change that after. So you're not then, if you can get away from emailing around a PDF or printing out a document, and you move to a point of people access the data live, then you can change it. So if you notice something, you can go and change it, and then they'll always see the latest version. Whereas obviously if you're reliant on printing things out or sending a PDF, then you've made a firm commitment, haven't you, to that report. So I think I probably just sound like a Tableau salesman now, but I think it is the way to go. I think, or maybe a similar tool, but I think the idea of having people getting the data themselves has got to be the long-term goal, or the medium-term goal for someone trying to do this kind of thing. Short-term, you might end up printing stuff out and putting it on a notice board, but to try and have a plan in your head of how you're going to migrate everyone to be self-service is probably the way to go.
Brilliant. And that kind of draws us to a close now then. I'll pass over to Eva in just a second to say our thanks. But firstly, from myself and everyone who's attended the user group, and also people who've helped set up, a massive thank you to you, Chris, for being able to take the time to do this, and know as well, being able to share this is actually really insightful for the community, hence the huge number of questions we've had. So really just wanted to say thanks from myself. And really, over to yourself, Eva. Actually, one last thing, something that we're working on doing is a webinar which links through to football transfers with one of our technical partners called Data Robot, which is an artificial learning platform. We're still waiting on a data source provider. We're having discussions with two at the moment, so we'll be sending some updates around that, and I've had kind of a conversation with you to get your opinion on it as well on LinkedIn. But yeah, just wanted to let everyone else who's still sort of tuned in to know that. But yeah, I'll pass over to Eva now to close up.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks everyone for being engaged and asking those questions. I think as a presenter, it's always nice to get that feedback from the audience. I want to encourage people again to go to the LinkedIn page, and also, why not between now and the next one, share some comments on what you would like to hear about. I think we've got a bit of flexibility in how we run this user group, and if you have a specific topic that you would be really curious to hear about, or you even want to suggest yourself as a speaker, please don't be shy and let us know. And then we'll share information about the next one, which I'm guessing will probably be in September, because August, we're in Europe, so we're all going on holiday for like 4 weeks. Clearly not, but yeah, anyway. So yeah, and a thank you from me also to Chris for sharing all of this. I think it was really insightful, and I'm sure that people learned a few things and got some new ideas for their own work.
Good stuff.
Okay. So Oscar, you'll have to be the one ending all of this technically.
So goodbye, everyone.
Cool. Thanks.